Hello friends, and welcome back to Dungeon Design in Zelda. Last time we completed the Skullwoods dungeon in the northwestern corner of the Dark World map. Conveniently, our next stop is the Village of Outcasts, just a short trip south of here. As was the case before, there isn't really much to talk about as far as pre-dungeon things to do. You don't even have to do these dungeons in this order, so really there's no quest line or anything like that. You can head straight here if you want. That said, an interesting thing I wanted to touch on was actually entering the dungeon itself. This is sadly another case of me just knowing a solution to a puzzle, but not knowing how I know it. The dungeon entrance is located under this gargoyle statue in the Village of Outcasts. You can grab the trident and pull it to break it apart and reveal the dungeon entrance. Simple enough if you know what to do, but what I am having trouble with is how you would figure that out. Again, this is one of those things that I just know, but for someone who doesn't have that prior knowledge, I can see them wandering around the village with no idea of what to do. I imagine that could be frustrating. Then again, this isn't an issue that I'm experiencing firsthand, so I could be overthinking the complexity of this, and maybe it is actually super obvious. So yeah, if you remember figuring this out, please let me know how that experience was for you. Otherwise, we may as well get right into it. Let's head into the dungeon. This is Thieves Town, a subterranean labyrinth situated beneath the Village of Outcasts. I should clarify that this naming convention is really a localization thing. In the original Japanese version of the game, the area above ground and this dungeon below share the same name, just as was the case with Skullwoods. In this case, both being roughly Village of Outcasts or Village of the Astray or something similar, however you want to interpret it. Point is that the naming convention doesn't draw such a distinction in the original Japanese version like it does in English. That said, guides and even Zelda Encyclopedia refer to the dungeon as Thieves Town, so that's what I'm going to call it for the sake of this video. Alright, let's get on with looking at the actual level design, because there's a lot going on here in this dungeon. As far as the overall layout goes, we can divide the dungeon into two distinct halves. The first being this labyrinthian section, which we'll have to carefully navigate to find the map, compass, and big key. The second section is structured a little more familiarly, with your classic room-to-room dungeon elements, but there is still a nice twist on this, as the boss room is immediately accessible but empty, and we'll find the maiden at the end of the dungeon, turning this into an escort mission, meaning we'll have to navigate back with the maiden in tow. That's a lot packed into one dungeon, and in hindsight, I'm a little surprised by just how much they accomplish here. But rewinding to that first section, it's pretty impressive how big in scope this labyrinth area feels while you're exploring here. Maybe it's because of how densely packed these rooms are, or how these walkways crisscross and overlap, and how ambiguous the navigation can feel, especially with these overhead walkways obscuring parts of the path and certain obstacles. It feels like you're crawling through a massive maze, but when you look at the map, it's really only 4 rooms. Granted, these rooms are larger than most dungeon rooms in this game, but even still, it feels so much larger than it really is, which is quite the testament to how much is packed in here. As I mentioned before, we'll find the map, compass, and big key all in this area, as well as a handful of other goodies. That big key in particular will be needed to move on to the second half of the dungeon. Worth a mention as well is how these paths twist and wind while they smartly spread these collectibles out, and how these treasure chests are often visible far before they're actually accessible. I've talked a lot already already in previous videos about how this game teases you with treasure chests that are out of reach, so I won't go too deep into that concept here, aside from mentioning that it is in full gear in this dungeon. Moving on to the second half of the dungeon, this whole section is a little more traditional dungeon-esque, with a lot of interconnected rooms and multiple floors. The big door that we emerge through takes us into this hallway with 3 more doors. The boss room at the end, as previously mentioned, can be reached right away from here, but there is an additional puzzle element in figuring out how to get the boss to actually appear, with us needing to blow a hole into the floor in the room above so that light can shine down into this room below, which feels rather innocuous if you don't already know the significance of this. And that is a big part of the appeal for me as far as this dungeon goes. There's a real sense of mystery here, a lack of boss despite an area for one, a maiden locked up deep in the basement, and a lot of rooms that connect and loop back on each other, which can make the navigation feel somewhat aimless at times. If you don't take the time to get really familiar with the dungeon layout, you're going to be walking in circles or into dead ends. And I love that. I always appreciate when a dungeon asks you to understand the bigger picture rather than just ushering you from room to room. The maiden found in the basement is also important here. The overall objective is to get the maiden from here up to that boss room, and to ensure that we already have the light shining in here. That's the larger puzzle summed up. It isn't too hard to do that either. Escort missions get a bad rap, but she doesn't have a hitbox or anything like that, so it really isn't intrusive to the combat or overall experience. One final point, I appreciate that this dungeon, like the Swamp Palace, deviates from the formula that nearly every other dungeon in this game has adhered to. This time around, there is no strictly linear combat gauntlet leading up to the boss fight, so that puzzle navigation element remains strongly at the forefront of how this dungeon plays right up to the very end. Which brings us to the boss fight. Once we've guided the maiden back up here and she's been exposed to this ray of light, the boss will actually reveal himself as Blind the Thief, who was disguised as the maiden. This reveal always creeped me out as a kid for some reason. I can't explain why, but I always remember that transformation as being more grotesque than it really is. But really, he just poofs in a little cloud. So yeah, this is Blind the Thief. Blind is an interesting mid-tier boss. I think the implicit backstory of him having been a Hylian light world dweller who was corrupted and transformed by greed is pretty interesting. Bosses just tend not to get as much of a backstory as this, but Blind is hinted at as being this boss pretty early on in the game, assuming you actually talk to the NPCs in Kakariko. From a world building standpoint, I like it a lot. His actual design isn't half bad either, even if he kinda looks like an evil red cat wearing a cheap Halloween ghost costume. Still, he is undeniably unique and memorable, and not a giant eyeball. And him being an actual sentient character who speaks, rather than just a big monster, is a good shakeup. As far as fighting him goes, it's a little less interesting. It is not a bad fight by any means, but it isn't amazing either. I'd put it somewhere in the middle if I were ranking boss battles. You just gotta hit him in the head with your sword a bunch until he dies. Though things do get a little bit more interesting, as well as bullet hellish, when his head comes off and he starts blasting fireballs everywhere. And then his head regrows, which then also detaches. And then you've just got a bunch of floating heads and fireballs and it's utter chaos. Bring a fairy or two. Overall, it's a pretty short and straightforward fight, but it's pretty fun. Not super interesting as far as combat mechanics go, but the rest of it and just how fun it is compensates for that. Once defeated, we'll get our heart container as usual. The actual maiden will be freed, and we're back out to explore the Dark World some more. So that's the dungeon. Overall, I like the Thieves Town dungeon, but I think it's my least favorite of the Dark World dungeons that I've talked about so far. So here's some gripes I have. You may have noticed that I didn't talk about the dungeon item at all. That item is the Titan's Mitt, an upgrade to the Power Glove, and it is placed way too far out of the way and feels frankly irrelevant to the rest of the dungeon. You do not need it for literally anything in this dungeon at all. That bothers me. It makes it feel like it was placed here without purpose. If I had it my way, I would have placed a few heavy blocks in key locations that we'd need the Titan's Mitt for, but they don't do that. Well, sorta. They actually do have 2 heavy blocks in the dungeon. This one, which 1 can be navigated around completely and 2 can already be lifted with the Power Glove, so again, we don't need the Titan's Mitt. The other heavy block only obscures the doorway to this room, which is a pointless trap room. Why they keep putting rooms like this in these dungeons is beyond me, because I still hate them. This room should not exist. Back to the Titan's Mitt though, there will be uses for it outside of this dungeon, in particular for upgrading your sword, but regardless, I just wish they'd found some purpose for it here, even if it was just to open up some shortcuts, but ideally more as a way to gate progression. Again, if it were up to me, I'd place a dark heavy block here in front of the jail cell and another one here above the boss room. Better yet, I'd also throw the big key up here too and change the big door location to be the boss room itself. And for good measure, place a small key here where we would find the big key. That way you can still lock off the second half of the dungeon. It's just a few small tweaks, but I think it would go a long way to improving the overall experience while making the sequence of this puzzle aspect feel a little more sensical. And hey, let's get rid of a few of those treadmill floors for good measure while we're at it. There's just too many. Those complaints and nitpicks aside, I still really do like this dungeon, and it does a lot of things really well. As I stated before, that overall sense of navigation is stellar, and I love that it makes you really have to understand the bigger picture. I also think that the dungeon makes good use of those red and blue gem switch barriers. Only one path is really gated by them, that being the path upstairs to the light room, but there's a few other barriers that they snuck in here and there, specifically in these spots, which ensure that your route will have to differ depending on which color is up or down. Above all else though, the best thing about this dungeon is how well it leans into 2 concepts: exploration and mystery. These are great driving factors that rest at the core of this dungeon's essence, with that mystery being the motivation for that exploration. The path is muddled, varied, and vague, and the rooms are a jumble that at first seem meaningless, but their purposes take shape as you make progress through the dungeon and begin to understand its mysteries. It's a dungeon that makes you ask questions, like, how do I get that treasure chest out of reach? Where is the boss? Why is this maiden locked in the basement? All of these questions get answered, so it all comes to fruition, but the very fact that they show up at all is what makes this such a good dungeon. So despite a few glaring flaws, Titan's Mitt, I still find a lot to enjoy about this dungeon. Thank you all so much for watching. Before we end this off, I just wanted to say thank you to the lovely people who supported me on Patreon or here on YouTube as a channel member, including but not limited to Grey Mage, Brenda, Tetra, Callie, Hylian West, Justin, Midnight Naomi, and Bunny. Thank you all so much for the support and for watching, and I will catch you all next time. Bye-bye. No, leave me alone. I don't want to be a bunny.